Audio. Hey, okay, looks like the audio is working. I actually have no idea whether you can hear me or not because I've got no feedback coming from this. What could possibly go wrong? Yes, lots of things. So, if anyone can hear me? Thanks, Rob. Cool. Okay, so basically I have no idea what I'm doing. And this is the point where you discover that on the internet everybody is a dog. So, all right, we've got a whole bunch of questions already. So, would you install a Sonoff Touch even though it has no certifications? Okay. Well, also, before I get into this, I just want to say that there are a whole lot of messages running by, and I don't have a moderator or anyone here to help me. So, if I miss questions or whatever, please forgive me. I'm going to do my best to follow what people are asking, but it's quite likely that I'm going to miss a whole lot of stuff. So I'll just do my best. And I can see a question about dimmers too. I'll get to that in a second. So, would I install a Sonoff Touch? In terms of whether it is safe, from what I've seen of the construction quality of Sonoff devices, I would be quite comfortable installing it. I would be as comfortable installing it as, say, a device from Clipsal or one of those big name companies. I don't think it's going to burst into flames. It's not going to do anything really bad. I've certainly bought some really cheap, low quality gear before and been a bit worried about installing it, so I haven't put it in. But from what I've seen of the quality of the IT products, particularly after going on that tour of the factory, and I saw the effort that they go to in terms of testing, so each of the devices is tested multiple times, I'm pretty confident that you'd put it in and it would be as safe as anything else. The issue is more certification and compliance, and the big problem with that is insurance. So this is one of those areas where I don't actually know what legal recourse you might have. So if you install a device in your house and it's not certified and something does go wrong, it's possible, for example, that your insurance company might say you're installing an uncertified device and therefore we're not going to honour your insurance policy. So that is probably the number one thing that would hold me back from installing that device. So to clarify in terms of the situation for my current house right now, I do use a bunch of Sonoffs, but I don't have them physically permanently installed. So the way a Sonoff is meant to be installed, you put it like inside your ceiling space in series with the power to a light or however you want to install it. What I've got is Sonoffs spliced into things like the power lead from a multi-way power board, and then I've got those around the place. For example, I've got those controlling lights and I've got them controlling bench lamps here, but it's not permanently installed by no attrition. It's a plug-in temporary device, which I think is a reasonable midway point. Now, when I was at IT, they did tell me that they are in the process of getting Australian certification. In the UK and I think the rest of Europe, they are certified. In China, they are certified, and they just don't yet have the piece of paper for Australia. And I'm expecting to see that any day now. They said it would take about 2 months before they had it, and that was when I was in China, which was a month and a half ago. So it could be any time. We might see that bit of paper come out, say, yes, they are now certified, and then you're all good for insurance. So I saw another question there earlier about dimmers. Right now, I don't have any dimmers in my house. Now, I do have some C-bus equipment here as well. I've done a little bit of work with C-bus in the past, and there are some universal dimmer units from C-bus. I've got a couple of 4-way dimmer units, and the problem with dimming is that there are a few different ways to do it, and different types of loads don't like different dimming methods. So you'll hear people talk about things like doing leading edge, like leading edge crossover cutting and stuff like that, or trailing edge, and different types of loads like LEDs versus halogen versus incandescent lights, and different types of drivers on LEDs in particular don't like different dimming methods. So with some things you can do simple PWM, but with a lot of stuff you can't, and it's kind of a complicated subject. So I really want to get into that in quite a bit of detail, and I'd like to set up some dimming around my house. Now I do have quite a few LIFX globes as well, and one of the advantages of some of the smart globes is that you don't have to worry about some kind of an external controller. Now they do use Wi-Fi, and I don't rely on that as my main control system, but in some situations, and actually this is a good subject to get into, I suppose. I did a video a little while ago where I talked about using hard cabling instead of Wi-Fi for home automation, and I got a fair bit of blowback for that. I had a lot of people say that I was living in the past and I should be using Wi-Fi. Now the point I was trying to make with that is that you need to use a solution which is appropriate for the particular problem. And if you're doing a retrofit and you have difficulty running cables, then Wi-Fi may be the correct solution. And what I was really reacting to was people saying I shouldn't have hardwired, I should be using Wi-Fi instead because it would be better somehow. But if you have the choice between doing a Wi-Fi connection and just like a hardwired cable connection, I would go for the hardwired connection every time, just because a bit of wire is going to be reliable. You don't get interference, you don't get bandwidth limitations and all those sorts of things. And yes, if I was doing a retrofit in a building where I couldn't easily recable it, then Wi-Fi would be a good way to do it. So yeah, in certain situations, and I do use Wi-Fi myself. It's not that I'm totally against wireless and would never use it. I use it in a lot of situations. It's just that you need to use it in the appropriate way and don't use it in preference to hardwiring something. Alexa, tell me a joke. Yeah, I've got an Alexa here. I don't have any text-to-speech. Okay, so there's a question there. John, how would you control a regular 3-position fan? So was that question about a fan where you have, say, 3 different speeds? So I assume it's off. Did I just change my shirt? No. A 3-position fan, probably the way to do that, the way they usually work is they run multiple cables to the fan. So in some ways it's a little bit like you have multiple loads. And in fact this is similar to how some electric blinds work. What they typically have is a 4-core cable going to them because they have earth and neutral, but then they have 2 actives. And if you energize one active, they go up. If you energize the other active, they go down. So the control systems for doing, say, electric blinds allow you to select between up and down energization using those 2 outputs. So for something like a 3-position fan, I think it would be very similar. I don't actually have any of those in my house, so I can't speak from practical experience with that. But I think the way they work is that you just have a separate active that is switched to each of the 3 speeds. It's a little bit like a bar radiator where you might have low, medium and high, and it just turns on different elements within the radiator by running power to them. So it changes how much output. James Bodie, I just saw wiring is undoubtedly best in the new house, but I live in a 400-year-old listed building, cabling is difficult. Yes, exactly. Like that's a situation where some kind of a wireless solution is probably the only practical way to do that. There was a question, why is this not in 1080p? That is because I am on a totally crappy internet connection. I'm on Telstra cable here in Melbourne, and the amount of bandwidth I have available is not that good. I actually paid extra to get their maximum speed option, and it's still not so good. The router they provide with it is terrible, and it drops out all the time, so I've set the broadcast software to run at a reduced resolution. If I can get this running more reliably, and this is partly a test, I didn't want to stress things too much for this first broadcast. If this all works well, then maybe I'll set it to 1080p for a future broadcast. Cosmin Bellin, have you ever used AC current sensor, non-invasive type, to confirm the state of a light? Yes, and to measure the power of the light as well. So actually what I could do is, because I'm here in my office, I could do a bit of a show and tell. What do I have? Energy monitor. So I have a huge number of projects that have never been mentioned or shown on SuperHouse. Power monitoring is something I've done, and I have the intention of doing a whole lot more coverage of this in the future. Now, when I first experimented with this, the first thing I did was I grabbed some of these current clamps. Basically, you put this around the active, and there is a voltage which is induced across this sensor, and you can plug this into a multimeter or something, and basically you get a measurement. It's millivolts of output per amps of current flow. So you can use those to measure how much current is flowing through a system. There is, obviously these are big and bulky, and these are really only for temporary testing. You walk up, plug it in, measure how much power is being used. There are other sensors like these ones, which essentially do the same thing. You run the active through the little coil. This is a Hall effect sensor, I think it is, and plug that into a device which can then read from that. And I have an example of one of those devices here. This is a device from Smart Energy Groups, which is run by a friend of mine, Sam Saby. And this is a little Arduino based energy monitor. It's a whole lot of stuff in there. So there are multiple channels. You can see that there are 8 channels, 2 rows, so there are 16 channels there of input. And basically what you do is use these sensors, plug them into one of these channels, the active runs through here, and then there's a little Arduino based system in here which can read from it. And then there's more stuff in the bottom, but basically what this allows me to do is measure the current on 16 channels simultaneously and then report it back to the home automation system. And the reason that I have this is that I'm intending to set something like this up, either this specific unit or another one, in my switchboard, because one of the advantages of having all of the power switched centrally through my switchboard is that I have one convenient place where I can measure the power to every load in the house. And I can do it pretty much independently, because I don't just have like a power circuit that that goes out to lights for a whole section of the house. I have one line going out to every lamp. What I can do in one very convenient place is run these current sensors and put them onto all of the outputs in the switchboard, and then I can get live power monitoring of every device in the house independently. So that is, there's some more sensors in there. There's also this commercial thing which I did a bit of work with a few years ago. It's called a Clipsal centimeter. Don't even know if it's still in here. I've had a few of these. Oh yeah, this is a new one. So very similar thing. This is very similar to Sam's system, except that it only has 3 channels, and it uses a sensor that you plug in. This one transmits its readings to a little display. You have this like on your kitchen bench or somewhere, and then from that you can just watch what the power consumption is around your house. So, and I've got other power monitoring systems as well. This is just the ones that I happen to have sitting in that box. But over the years I've done quite a bit of work with power monitoring. And I've also done pulse counting on the energy meter as well. So yeah, I've actually already started filming 2 episodes about energy monitoring, and both of them ended up just not really progressing very well, and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. So hopefully that answers that. Okay, so another one. Yeah, CT sensors, that's right. Current transformers and Hall effect sensors. So I've used all the different types. Okay, Chris Armstrong said switchboard equals consumer unit in the UK. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that terminology before. So consumer unit is what you would normally call a switchboard. I'll have to remember that. OpenHAB versus Home Assistant. Yes, I've seen that one go past a couple of times. I have not done anything much with Home Assistant. So the reason that I started using OpenHAB was a few years ago. I was running my system with MQTT for messaging. I had my own little rules engine which was reading from light switches and then updating outputs. And the only interface that I had for any kind of GUI was a web-based interface. So what I was becoming really frustrated with was I wrote a little web system that had a configuration file. It was all done in PHP, and what would happen is that you would load it up in your phone or on a tablet on the wall or whatever, and on the server side, the PHP would read the configuration file, get a list of the widgets, and then display them all, and there were on and off buttons. It used AJAX, so asynchronous JavaScript, to do the updates. So when you press a button, it would fade out and you get the response and that sort of thing. But it was quite limited. Like, I wanted to do sliders and color selectors and things, and so I started looking around for systems that would provide a nice app that I could run on the phone or some other device. And OpenHAB came with the cross-platform app. I use both Android and iOS devices, and I also wanted to be able to access it from tablets, things like stuff stuck on the wall. And so I largely got it because I wanted to use the app, and running OpenHAB in the background was quite easy to integrate with the rest of my system. So initially, there was almost no change to the existing system. OpenHAB was just sort of bolted on the side of it so that when control signals come from the app, it would then send updates to all of the existing scripts and things that I was already running. So it basically made a very easy upgrade. It made a very easy path to replace my homebrew HTML interface with the app that comes with OpenHAB. And that was quite a few years ago. I think Home Assistant was either not around at the time, or it was new, or I just wasn't aware of it. So now, particularly with the rise of things like Alexa and all of the smart home assistants, that area has expanded dramatically. And what I really want to do is spend a bit of time exploring things like Home Assistant and various other options, and see what they are. Now, one of the things is that it's a bit strange that so many people actually care about what I'm doing, because all of this started just because it's my hobby and I like to play around with my house. So a lot of the decisions that I've made, like whether I use OpenHAB or Home Assistant or whatever, they're not necessarily made for the greatest reasons. They do things like, I make decisions on the basis of what's easy, or I saw some friend post about it and thought, I'll give that a try, or whatever. So it becomes, a little bit ad hoc. I'm not really doing things like installing every possible home automation management system and then comparing them all and then picking the best one. It's like whichever one gets my attention at the time. But I really should do that a little bit more. Oh, sorry. So the comment from Rob Schmidt. I won't say trigger words anymore for the various home automation systems. I got Simon too. OpenHAB tutorials I just saw from Mr. Fixes. Yes, that's definitely been my my intention. One of the things is that my OpenHAB setup is still running on 1.8.3, I think it is. In fact, one of the things I could do, because we're doing this live stream, is I could log into systems and show you live. The configuration has changed a bit in 2, and actually, can anyone hear the fact that someone has just started whippersnipping right behind my wall? This wall you can see behind me is a vacant lot, and they are just about to start building, and they're using a whippersnipper and hitting the back of the wall, so I've got a big buzz behind my head now. Yeah, Michael, sorry about that. Not much I can do about it. Where was I? I can't remember. What do you think about Node-RED? Okay, Node-RED I like in that it's very easy to... yeah, it's really loud now. They're right against that wall. No, they wouldn't have done it yesterday. They would have burst into flames. So I'm losing track of this now because it's all running past so fast. Where was I? There was a question. Oh, I'm not sure. Alright, PoE for lights. Power over Ethernet for lights. I don't know. Using Power over Ethernet for lights suggests that you've got some kind of intelligence or Ethernet at the far end of... Oh yes, Node-RED. Good point. I'll get back to it. And OpenHAB tutorials. I'm losing the plot now. If you use Power over Ethernet for lights, that suggests that you're using something like you're using something with some intelligence at the light end itself. And I'm just not sure I can see the use case for it. If there are particular ways to make use of it, if you have existing Power over Ethernet infrastructure, then it could be worthwhile. But if you are putting in Power over Ethernet specifically to put lights on the end of it, I don't think there's a lot of benefit to that. You might as well just put in regular cabling, which is designed for running higher power loads, and then putting the intelligence locally if you're going to run the cable. PoE lights, what's the current draw? Yeah, I think that's right. There are several different PoE standards. There is the AT standard, 802.3 AT, I think, may be the most recent. I can't remember. And the power available in that standard was increased fairly dramatically. It's a reasonably good. It's a reasonable amount of power, but now that we're using LEDs a lot more, it would be practical. And there's a friend of mine, Julian Goodwin, who works in Sydney. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name the company he works for or tell you anything much about what he's doing, but he's done some interesting work with extremely high power PoE installations at a certain very large company that you would all know. And one of the things he's done is made some custom boards to push as much power as possible through Power over Ethernet. And I'm pretty sure that he is breaking the spec in order to do it, but he's running enormous amounts of power through Power over Ethernet. Okay. There were two things that I had to get back to. One was OpenHAB tutorials. So I actually had in mind a series of OpenHAB tutorials, and what I was going to do was go through setup of an OpenHAB system, and then OpenHAB 2 came out, and my my plans for the tutorials went out the window because the configuration changed. Now there is still a fair bit of compatibility. But the thing is that there is a new way of doing the configuration in OpenHAB 2, and the configuration methods used in OpenHAB 1 are still probably fairly valid. You can take OpenHAB 1 configurations with some minor changes, you can make them work on OpenHAB 2. But I'm actually still running OpenHAB 1.8, and I have an OpenHAB 2 box running alongside it, but it's not live running the house right now. So I didn't want to be going out and doing a tutorial and saying this is how you configure it when I didn't know enough about the new way of doing things. So I need to know a little bit more about it. Show us your bench setup, and I saw time for a new office tour as well. So yes, cool, I'll get to that. The other thing was a question about Node-RED, and what do I think about Node-RED? I haven't currently got I have Node-RED running on my Raspberry Pi, which is running OpenHAB as well. So it's on the machine that's currently running my house, but I'm not actively using it for anything because my own rules engine is still doing the various mappings and things that I need. From what I've seen just playing around with Node-RED, I've sorry, I'm having trouble keeping track of all the questions here. Chris, I will try to remember to get back to that. So I have experimented with Node-RED a bit, and I've set up some rules and just tried to set up some inputs and then rules that do outputs and stuff. And it seems to be really intuitive. However, and the thing is that I do intend to replace all of my rule system with Node-RED. One of the things that I don't know yet enough about with Node-RED is how the configuration is done behind the scenes. And I suppose I'm Dodgy Brothers. Do you need Node-RED when you have OpenHAB? Technically, no. You could do the entire job with Node-RED, or you could do the entire job with OpenHAB, but they have different strengths. So I think they work well together. What I would do is use OpenHAB or Home Assistant or whatever for managing the state and providing the user interface, and Node-RED for rules. So I wanted to, in terms of Node-RED, I'm probably a little bit old-fashioned, and I like to be able to see configuration files. So I just have this personal fear when I use any kind of a tool where you have a configuration GUI and you set things up and make it work, and somehow the configuration is stored magically. And to some extent, I find that a little bit with the new OpenHAB 2 system as well, like the way you go in through the GUI and then add things. I feel much more comfortable if I can open a text file in Vim, set some rules, save it, and then I can version the text file, stick it in Git, and then I know that I can back it up. But if the configuration is in some mysterious database behind the scenes somewhere and I don't know where it's stored on disk, it just makes me feel really uneasy. Like, how do I recover? Do I need to set everything up again? Unless I do like a full backup of the entire machine. So I'd like to be able to see deeply into the configuration. The question there was, I saw about what do I mean by rules. So what I mean by that is, in my own particular case, it's mostly mappings. It's things like, and Igor said you might not know enough Node-RED. True, I don't. I need to learn more about it. It's quite possible that the configurations are somewhere easily accessible if you look behind the scenes, and I just haven't looked into it enough. But that's just my general feeling on GUI configuration with mysterious save somewhere versus edit a text file. Maybe I'm just old school. I've been playing around with Unix systems for too long. So, so with, I prefer to see config files. Oh, and also one thing I should point out, and I've got to apologize for this as well, there's something weird going on with my YouTube interface, and I can't actually scroll back in that one. Oh, I can scroll back in this one. So as things have been scrolling off the message box, I haven't been able to go back and remind myself what they were. Rules, what do I mean by rules? That's right, that's what I was talking about. I need someone to help me queue up these questions. What I mean is, for my own particular case, it's mostly mappings between events like sensors going outside of a certain range, or a button being pressed, or some like a motion detector being triggered, and some kind of output. So, oh, Node-RED uses a JSON file for config storage. Awesome. Okay, thanks for that information. So what I do is create a series of rules that say things like, if this particular button on the wall has been pressed, then send this event to MQTT. So they're usually very simple mappings like that. But there are also mappings like, if the motion detector in the bathroom is triggered and auto light mode for the bathroom is true, and then switch the status of the fan and the light to on and start a timer, and the timer is reset each time the motion detector is triggered, but if the timer expires, then turn the lights and the fan off. So basically, it means that you can create logic around different things and make your house behave in a different way. And also rules like, if the motion detectors, not the motion detectors, if the smoke detectors are triggered, turn on every single light and unlock all the doors. You know, those sorts of things. So, so that's basically what I mean by rules. And so that sort of thing you can definitely do within systems like OpenHAB, because it has a rules system in it. But I just personally find that the rules system in OpenHAB is quite clunky. I do run quite a few rules in it. I set timers in it and do different things. And the other thing is that then you need to restart OpenHAB when you modify the configuration, so that can be a bit of a pain. So anyway, that's the reason that I have this breakdown between the OpenHAB for maintaining state, like whether a particular light is currently turned on, and then a rules engine external to it, which is basically just poking things into it, because OpenHAB itself provides an API. What you can do is have, it's got like a RESTful API where you can have endpoints for different items within OpenHAB. So your rules engine can do things like either publish to MQTT, in which case OpenHAB can subscribe to that and do an update, or it can poke directly into OpenHAB and say, use the API to give it direct commands like turn that light on or toggle its state, and you can control all of that through the external rules system. And that way you don't need to mess around with rules within OpenHAB. All it has to do is have a list of the items and maintain their states, and then it provides the user interface that you can run on your phone. Okay, okay, what video, where did I find it? There was a question there about what happens if I'm not around anymore. Yes, that is something that I have thought about a bit. High availability, all sorts of cool topics here. Let's see, I will find that particular video because someone was asking where to find it. And what I've done is I actually started losing track of things myself. So a little while ago I set up a page which I will paste into the chat now. That one, which has, it's basically just an index of the different Superhouse episodes that I've done so far, and it makes it a little bit easier to find. So the question was about what if I'm not around anymore, or whatever, or even if I'm selling the house, that sort of thing. And episode 23 was preparing your home automation system for death, and that is probably the one that is relevant for that particular question about what happens if I'm not around anymore. Have I used AWS IoT? No, I haven't. I've used AWS extensively for other things in my software business, which I no longer have. I sold that early last year, and we used Amazon Web Services for the classic web stack database, LAMP stack stuff. But oh, that page can't be found. Really? Was that the episodes list? Maybe I stuffed that up. How did I do that? Let me test that. Oh, okay. Oh, it's a YouTube redirect. I'm not quite sure how that works. Okay, but if you go to URL doesn't change, but it works. Okay, thanks, Zach. Hey, Zachary, good to see you. So if you have trouble getting to that, just go to, yeah, exactly, Rob. Go to SuperHouse.tv, and then there's a link at the top of the page that says episodes, and that will get you to it. Now, I've also done a few videos that I've just done as vlogs rather than as full episodes, and some of those are relevant as well, but I don't have a nice index of those. So sometimes people ask me about questions and I say, oh, I've already done a video about that. Oh, actually, no, it wasn't in SuperHouse. So that's why they haven't seen it. Oh, Gavin just said OpenHAB 2 doesn't need a restart after editing rules and items. That is fantastic. That makes it a whole lot less painful, and I'm much more motivated now to do something about upgrading. Chris said, off topic, are you in Sydney? No, not quite. I'm about 1,000 kilometres south of there. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. But I will be in Sydney in a couple of weeks' time. I'm going up there for linux.conf.au, which is the big annual Linux open source conference here in Australia and intermittently in New Zealand. And I'll be running the Open Hardware mini-conf along with a few other people from the Melbourne hackerspace and other hackerspaces around Australia, all getting together to run a one-day mini-conference about open source hardware and hardware hacking. Okay, so redundancy, plan for redundancy. Aha, yes, just moved into Docker Swarm, already helping a lot. Next point is the router. Okay, so some good questions there. Redundancy is certainly a big issue for home automation systems, particularly when you have a centralized hub-based system. There are several different architectures that you can use for home automation, and this is something that I was thinking of talking about more in the episode about home automation system architecture, which ended up just being an explanation of my current architecture. But what I really wanted to do was talk about multiple options, so decentralized versus centralized, etc. And someone asked for details of that event. Okay, for LinuxConf AU, that is, let's see, I'll put in the Open Hardware Conf link. That the Open Hardware Conf is an event that you can only attend if you are at the Linux conference, which is this thing. I'll put this link in as well. So LinuxConf is the annual Linux conference that happens every year. Of course it is, because it's annual. And so what happens is that it's basically like a birds of a feather session or like a specialist substream. They provide opportunities for members of the open source community to run targeted streams at the start of the conference. And this will be the 9th year in a row now that some friends and I have run the Open Hardware mini conference. So it's like a one-day conference on open hardware. But because it's taking place within the main Linux conference, you need to be attending the Linux conference to go to the particular open hardware stream. but I'll be in Sydney, and I will have a car because we've got to take up a whole lot of gear. So if there are people in Sydney that feel like meeting up, I'll probably go along to the Sydney Hackerspace at least once. So yeah, it could be an opportunity to meet up with people that I wouldn't otherwise get to see. Okay, so have you used the Sonoff Pro 4-channel yet? No, I have one in a box over on the shelf. And I haven't yet plugged it in. In fact, IT sent me a couple of odds and ends a little while ago before I went to China. And the intention was that I was going to do have a look at those and maybe do a video showing some of the different Sonoff models. And then I didn't end up getting around to it before I went away on the trip. So I'm going to get back to that. They actually sent me an engineering sample of their little RF bridge, which I think you can just buy retail now. It's actually available as a product, but they sent me one. Now let's plug it in now. Yeah, I should try doing some of these sorts of things more as a live exercise. In fact, what I was thinking of doing was maybe even doing a live stream of designing a PCB just for the fun of it. James, do you have the 433 megahertz wireless gateway? Yes, I think that's the same device as the engineering sample that I have. So the one I have is not in like final retail box, injection molded and everything. It's like a handmade prototype. Rob, let's see the bench. I'll move out of the way. So this is a part of it, and the actual bench itself is, well, the distance that you can see down there, it goes about the same distance in that direction. So it's the two sides of the room, and my computer is directly into the corner here, which lets me have the screens wrap around, and it all fits quite nicely. So I've got to say that I am incredibly lucky to have this set up at home. It's probably one of the best home workshops that I've seen, and it came about because we were doing a renovation on our house and adding. So we had a house with just like a little carport on the end of it. So basically, there was the house, and then directly beside it, on the end of the house, was the carport, and it was all falling down, and it was really in terrible state. So we did some renovations and had a concrete slab poured for the carport directly on the end of the house, and the idea was that that would all be extended and fully enclosed. But while doing that, since we were already putting the slab in, what we did was have the design change so that it essentially doubled the depth of it. So it's like a two-car carport, and then behind it, it goes further back, and then put a wall across. And the incremental cost of doing the longer structure versus the regular size structure was not huge. It's more, but it wasn't double or anything like that. So whippersnipper and carport, I could put things in the boot of my car, and there's all sorts of weird stuff that people might not understand. So it's what Homer calls a car hole. Yes, in the garage, except that what we call a carport in Australia is not usually enclosed. It's usually just like a roof with poles or whatever to hold it up. Whereas a garage we would consider to be fully enclosed. So it was just a roof, and it was all open to the elements apart from that. How did you start the car from your phone? Oh, that's going back into ancient history. I'll get back to that if I don't forget this question. Anyway, about the workshop. So I ended up having the opportunity to basically extend the garage, make it double depth. So what I've got here is essentially the size of a two-car garage. It's like 6 meters by 6 meters, but it's just a slightly odd shape because of the boundary. And one corner of it is separated out for a little bathroom, because part of the justification for doing this was when we renovated the house, we figured that if we sell the house, this could be considered to be a granny flat or extra accommodation, or rumpus room or something. So we put the bathroom in while we had the opportunity to run the plumbing through the concrete slab. So this could be self-contained accommodation. So in the short term, it makes a fantastic workshop for me, and then ultimately if we sell the house, then hopefully it adds value to the house. And while I was doing that, the electrician came along and pre-cabled, because we did all of that while it was at framing stage. And I drew up a little diagram of how I wanted him to wire up things like all the power points, because I'd planned it where I was going to put all of the equipment and how it would all fit. And I gave him this diagram, and it had 72 power outlets on it. And he looked at it and had a bit of a heart attack and said, "Surely you don't need 72 power points in your workshop." And I said, yeah, I kind of do. And he ended up running 3 dedicated power circuits just for this workshop. So I've got rows of 4-way power outlets all the way around at different levels of the wall, both above and below the workbench. You probably can't really see it, but there's a 4-way power board there. There's another one directly above it. There's another one behind the computer here, and then corresponding ones under the bench as well. So I've got lots of power, which is good. You can never have too much. So I've lost track about these questions. I would like to hear more about different smart home architectures. Yes. So I started talking about that. Centralized versus decentralized, and of course there are hybrid methods as well. What I'm currently running here is a centralized, how many outlets are occupied? Almost all of them, and I've got power boards. I should have put in more power points. Is an almost entirely centralized system. So I've got the control happening in the switchboard. I've got the OpenHAB system providing the actual control signals and maintaining the state. And video a bit lumpy. It probably is on the uplink because my internet connection here is not that great. The car. Hopefully I'll get back to that. So I really need someone here taking notes for me so I stay on track. Yes, centralized versus decentralized. Now, it's a bit of a trade-off, and I wish I could find it, but quite a while ago I saw a paper. This was many years ago. I saw a paper. This is in relation to perceived reliability of software systems, and it wasn't specifically talking about home automation. It was talking about technology in general and the psychological impact of the frequency of faults against the severity of the fault. And it comes down to things we're already familiar with in technology, like mean time between failure and all of those sorts of problems. So if you have a device, statistically it's going to fail on average after a certain period of time, or you go a certain period of time between failures, whatever the particular way it is that works. So if you have 2 identical devices, then your average mean time between failure is going to be half than if you had just one of them. So by having more devices, your mean time between failure for the system as a whole decreases, and you end up with more frequent failures. But of course, if you have more simple devices, you both extend their lifetime, so they're probably less likely to fail, but you also increase the likelihood that you also compartmentalize, so the severity of failure is smaller. And that's where, for example, it's the trade-off of having one complex centralized controller that runs all of your lights and turns all of the lights on and off. And if that fails, then you lose control of everything, so you've got no lights whatsoever. Versus having smart lighting. Say you've got Philips Hue or LifeX or whatever. So you have lights that are distributed, and each light has electronics in it. And the electronics itself is probably simpler than your big centralized controller that runs all of the lights. But you've got far more of them. So you might have 30 or 40 or 50 globes in your house. Each one of those has electronics in it, and it could fail. But of course, if it fails, the only thing that fails is that one light. You don't lose the whole house. So the impact of the failure is compartmentalized and it's much smaller. So the thing is that when you start to think about this, it's quite interesting because you might think that compartmentalizing is better, and in some ways it is because the impact of the failure is lower. But what I found really interesting about this particular paper that I read about the psychological impact of the failure of IT systems is that it basically came to the conclusion that if you have infrequent, so rare, major failures, it's actually better than having frequent minor failures in terms of the perception of reliability of the system. And there's a whole lot of other complications as well. For example, time to repair. So how long does it take before the service is restored? And this is something that I've been really wanting to do an episode about because I just found it really interesting when I read about this at the time, and I want to research it a bit more because in some ways it informs the decisions that we make in terms of how these systems are architected. So a system that you rely on to work, you want to be able to turn on the lights and have them work. And it's not just you, it's everybody else that lives in the house who aren't necessarily technical, or they don't have your same passion for home automation or whatever. You don't want to get them offside. So any time that things go wrong, there will be backlash. You'll get, major failure is really damaging. That's why I moved to the Docker cluster. So that's basically it. So if you, what it comes down to is that if you have a system with lots of small, simple devices and you have small, localized, simple failures, say once a month, which might mean something like your light bulb has failed, so you've got to replace it, versus having a major failure where everything dies once a year, then having the major once a year failure is a lower psychological impact than having the minor failure once a month. And I'm just making up numbers in terms of time, but that's the general gist of what it was saying on this particular paper. And I found that really interesting. So the idea is to try to have the longest duration possible between failures, even if the failure itself is more significant as a result. Because the feeling of people living in the house then is that it's more reliable. And if you're always worried that at any time something could not work, it just gives you the feeling that everything is broken all the time. Okay, so there were some questions about the car. All right, I won't go into that in great detail. It's really weird when you work on these sorts of projects, and something that back at the time was really unusual, and you look at it now and you think, oh yeah, that's nothing really particularly significant. Things like remote start or having a car connected to the internet these days is not that unusual. But back when I did that to my RX-8, it was really quite strange. And so what I did with that, someone asked about it earlier, there was a conference talk that I did in at LinuxConf, actually, that same conference many years ago. When was that talk? It was probably about 2008, 2009. I did a talk about how I connected my car to the internet. So what I did was basically splice into the ignition system. So essentially I made a little socket and hotwired my own car. And the socket was connected in under the dashboard where the ignition system is, and I set it up so it could bypass the RFID key. Yes, search for RX-8 controlled from iPod Touch, thanks. And so what I did was have a connection to the ignition system, and I had an Arduino mounted up under the dash, which could apply power to the ignition system and it could fire the starter motor. And what that allowed is software control over the car being started and stopped. And I also had control over things like locking and unlocking, opening the boot, and I also put an OBD interface on it. In fact, if you look at, I wonder if I've got it here, probably do. In my book, Practical Arduino, one of the projects was a vehicle data logging system. And in that, I had an Arduino Mega connected to an OBD2 interface, which connected to the car so that it could query the engine management system to get data from it. And it had GPS as well. So what I could do is, on this car control system, which also had a 3G modem connected to it, so it was connected to the internet and I was running dynamic DNS. So basically I had an interface into my car from wherever I wanted to be. I could either SSH into the car or pull up a web interface. And from that I could get the data coming out of the engine management system. I could lock it, unlock it, start it and stop it, all of those sorts of things. And these days with things like Tesla, which is online all the time and so many cars now have built-in internet connections, it's not really so unusual. But back when I did this, which was, I don't know, 10 years ago, that was a bit of an unusual thing. So, do you want to join a Discord server? Yeah, actually, something I've been thinking about. Did you get feedback to the Arduino to tell the engine has started and then release the starter pulse? Short answer is no, not on that particular project. Now, what I did was I just pulsed it for a certain period of time that I knew would work. It was, I can't remember the number, it was like 1 second or something, 1.5 seconds. So, but I have actually done that in the past. Many years ago, back when when I first went to uni, I went to Monash Uni. I was doing a degree which was a Bachelor of Applied Science in Robotics and Digital Technology. So I started that course and I never actually finished it. I left partway through. And while I was actually at uni, I started I think it was my first proper business, other than, lawn mowing and stuff like that as a kid. Which was a company called Rotor Systems Research, and I used to do automotive electronics. So I did things like, I think the first project I did or product I did was a turbo timer, and then I started getting into some more advanced stuff. And one of the things I did was an interlock for race cars, like it was a fuel pump interlock for race cars. So it would detect the ignition pulses, and if the ignition pulses stopped, it would disable the fuel pump. And the reason for that was that if the car was involved in a crash, for example, and the driver is incapacitated or whatever, and they forget to flick the big red kill switch that kills all the power to the car, the system would detect if the engine has stalled or is unable to run, and it would turn off the fuel supply. So I did... so I have done work in the past with things like detecting the ignition pulses, but for the particular project I did with MyRax 8, I didn't bother. I just ran it for however long it was that I discovered was reliable, and each time it fired, it started. What I could do, of course, is the system itself was reporting engine RPM and various other things back out of the OBD2 interface. So if I started the car, and then there was no revs coming up on the engine, you know that it hasn't actually started. Okay, how did you bypass the steering wheel lock? I didn't, because I wasn't driving the car by remote control. I was only starting it, accessing the engine management system and controlling things like that. So I didn't need to actually move the steering wheel. So one of the things I would like to do, maybe in a future video, is some kind of car home automation system integration. Way back when I was first thinking about doing videos, one of the things I wanted to do was like a watchdog timer for the ignition. Yeah, exactly. That's a good analogy. So one of the things I was thinking of doing was talking about integrating cars into home automation systems. And there are a whole lot of things that you can do. For example, you can do geofencing. So you could have the location of your car being tracked by your home automation system. If the car itself has some kind of device in it, and the way I did this in the past was actually with a cell phone. So if you have a mobile phone permanently left in your car and just plugged in so that it can recharge whenever it needs to, and you can run some software on it that will be reporting the position of the car back, and then your home automation system can say when the car is approaching the house and it gets within 1 kilometre or whatever boundary you set, then you do things like turn on lights, and as you get within 100 metres of your garage, you can start to open your garage door. And there were other things I was thinking about at the time which aren't relevant anymore, but there were things like syncing your music between an in-car MP3 player and your home entertainment system, so that when you drive into your garage, your car syncs up with everything in the house. So I had plans to do some car-related home automation stuff, extend the home automation system out into the world, including your car, not just your house. And own tracks, GPS to MQTT, yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. I've used own tracks as well in the past. How does the house know whether you're coming or going? Yeah, you can check that just by setting a threshold and then changing. For example, if the distance is decreasing, then you know it's approaching. If it's increasing, you know it's going away. And you'd set a certain hysteresis so that you don't have it geofencing, so that you don't have it flapping, like a flapping state where it thinks, oh, it's coming, it's going, it's coming, it's going. So you set some latency and hysteresis into it. Polar boundary, yeah. So what are your certifications in electronics? Nothing. So I started that Bachelor of Applied Science, as I mentioned, but I left before finishing the degree, went off and was running my own business. And I've been doing this sort of stuff ever since, but technically I don't have a piece of paper on the wall that says I'm qualified to do anything. So I basically just make it up as I go. I've been doing electronics since I was really little. When I was really small, my parents had a good friend who was an electronics technician who lived in the bungalow at the back of our house. So we lived in Abbotsford at the time, or in Collingwood, which is sort of inner-ish Melbourne, and on a fairly big property for that area, and we had an actual backyard with a bungalow in it. And so from the time that I was little, we had this electronics technician living out the back, and he set up a home workshop. So when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I'd be out the back looking at all the stuff that he was doing, and I got into it that way pretty much. So I've just been playing around with electronics ever since. Any thoughts? Oh yeah, so Bluetooth low energy beacons, and that ties into a comment I saw just a moment ago, which was presence detection. And short answer is yes, both those are two related things that I want to experiment with. In fact, well, you can't see it right now, but on the screen up above me, I've got a stream of MQTT messages coming from a Happy Bubbles presence detection system. And what it does is, the way this system works, I want to do a whole episode about this because it's pretty cool. I haven't really got it working to my satisfaction, and I want to figure out what I'm doing wrong before I really start telling other people about it. But basically what it does is use a BLE device which you can put multiples of them around your house, and then it just does like signal strength measurement. So if you have a BLE beacon, which could be either a hardware device or it could be something like a mobile phone with BLE, and you can run a software beacon essentially, then the receivers that you place around your house can all talk to that beacon and get the signal strength. So what they can do is work together, and there is a location management system that is aware of all of the receivers around your house, and it can say, oh yeah, the signal is strongest on that one, but I'm getting a bit of signal from that one, so it must be somewhere in that area. And it gives you an estimate of the distance in meters from the different locations to your beacon, or to all of the beacons, so you can have multiples and have it track. Why don't you just let Raspberry Pi check your Wi-Fi? Yep. And you forget your keys more often than your phone. Yes, that's right. So that's another way of doing it, is using signal strength from Wi-Fi. And there are also some interesting time of flight systems. Now, presence detection, so I'm experimenting with this with the Happy Bubble system and BLE. Right now, the only presence detection that I'm doing is motion detectors. So the same thing you would use in a security system, which is not very good at all. I have experimented with a few other systems. One thing I did quite a few years ago was I used a Microsoft Kinect, which many of you would be familiar with. It's the depth camera that runs off there, that I think has just been discontinued, but it runs on the Xbox, and it allows the Xbox to do things like track the position of your hands. And I did a conference talk about this many years ago. And in fact, I'm probably about to repost the video for this conference talk to the Superhouse channel, because it really covers some of the background of the philosophy of why I'm doing this. And it's not just gadgets for the sake of gadgets. It's I suppose the summary is that it's like giving yourself Jedi powers through the use of technology. And that particular conference talk was all about that. So I was using the Kinect for gesture recognition. So wave your hands and the blinds go up, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I experimented with a little bit with the Kinect was using it for presence detection. And I haven't heard of anybody else doing this, and I've never really talked about it, but other than, just talking to friends about it, but I've never published anything about it online. What I did was, the way the Kinect works, it provides two video streams. One video stream is RGB values, which is basically like just literally a video of whatever the device is looking at. And the other is the structured light output, which is also done as a video stream. So you can basically treat it like a camera. But the signal that you get back out of it, the RGB values map to the distance to the particular surface in front of the camera at that point. So what happens is that instead of getting what you would think of as a photographic image, you get what looks like a very stylized cartoon. So you have flat blocks of color for surfaces that are the same distance from you. So in this particular case, well, it's a little bit hard to explain, but say I have my arm in front of my face here. This is a bad example, it's not working. But if you have, say, an object, well, actually, here's a really good example. If you look at looking at the camera here, it's all reversed. You look at my chair here, and then up over there, there is another black area. That's a different chair. That's actually about 3 meters away behind me. But if you just looked at the video stream that's coming through the live stream now, you can't really tell the difference. It just looks like a black shape. If you had a Kinect and you were looking at the depth camera data coming from that, you would see a very distinct shape, which is the arm or the headrest of my chair here, and then a totally different color for the other black chair behind me because it's at a different distance. So what that allows you to do is measure, the intent for that is so that you can do things like hand tracking very accurately, because the output you get from it is ideal for sending to software that is normally used with just a regular video stream. But because it's already done the work of figuring out the distance, you get very sharp edges, and it means that things like gesture detection is really accurate. It's much better than with a normal video signal. But anyway, that's kind of my background. What I was doing for presence detection is the video picture that you get back is essentially an array of RGB values showing the distance to every point within the frame of the video. And the way you can use that is by summing the depth values. You can essentially get a number that represents the volume of space in front of the Kinect. And by setting a baseline, you can tell if there is something in that field of view that wasn't there before, whether it's moving or not. And so the classic problem with things like detection of someone in a room when they're not moving is that the motion detector will just stop detecting them, and then if you're sitting still in your chair, the lights will go out after a couple of minutes, which is no good. But with something like using the depth camera and analysing the volume of the contents of the room, you can tell if there's someone there, even if they're not moving, because the volume has gone up. So yeah, the occupied volume of the room has gone up. And another really interesting thing is that I haven't experimented with, but I'd like to, is radar. There are some systems now that use radar that are accurate enough that they can detect breathing. So you could have someone lying on a couch asleep, and if the radar pointing into the room is capturing that person, the movement of their body as they're breathing will be enough for the system to detect, hey, there's movement in the room, so there is something over there at this particular distance. And you can then feed that back into the home automation system. So, yeah, I've kind of gone off on a long side talk about this now, but presence detection is one of those fundamental problems that I don't think is well enough solved in home automation. And I've looked at a whole lot of these different systems like motion detectors, Kinect, volume analysis, and all of those sorts of things, and BLE, and etc. And I think what really needs to happen is that it needs to be a combination of all of these different things. So we need feeds from cameras to do image processing, and we need detection of phones, and for example, you have the problem where if you're tracking someone's phone, they put it down in the kitchen and walk out, then the home automation system will think the kitchen is occupied when it's not anymore. So it actually becomes a fairly complicated problem. You need to be able to take into account all of these different data sources and then have the system make judgment calls. And this is where things like machine learning come in as well. And my friend Andy Jelmy has been doing a lot of work on this recently, using machine learning primarily from video streams, but you can apply it to other techniques as well. So if we have all of these different data sources about what's happening within the house and a machine learning system which is processing it, then we can hopefully achieve a system that is going to allow the house to make judgments about, oh, is this room occupied, or are they likely to go into this next room within the next few seconds, so I should turn the lights on before they even get there, and those sorts of things. Some of the Chinese radar modules are surprisingly good and incredibly affordable, James just said. Yeah, I really want to experiment with that. That's quite high on my list of things to try. Okay, so time for me to do a mental catch up. Where are we up to with questions? Start with hardware, watchdog timers, timeout, GPS, talking about individual rooms. Yes, so I have had some people suggest GPS, and as White CGI said, GPS is only reliable down to, indoors it can be very unreliable. Really 5 or 10 meters is sort of the level that you can expect. And one of the other things I want to do, in fact this is something that I've started doing some work on but I haven't started filming yet, is investigating assisted GPS, and basically GPS that has a known fixed location, so it can correct for environmental, like atmospheric variations. So the reason, Superhouse Forum, yes, that was something that someone talked about discourse earlier, and that's something I want to get to, definitely. So the issue with GPS is the reason that it's not super spot on accurate is that as the signal comes in through the atmosphere, there is slight variation, and so that's why sometimes when you have GPS, it might think that your location is wandering a little bit, even when it's got a really good lock. And that's because the actual path of the signal is varying by a tiny amount. So one of the ways to make GPS more accurate is to use an external reference point. So what you can do is have a known location, which could be surveyed, so that you know this particular location is accurate, like down to a centimetre or whatever accuracy the surveyors have used. And you have a GPS receiver at that known location, and then it is measuring the deviation of the signal compared to what it knows its actual fixed location is. And then you have another GPS receiver which is on the device that you're wanting to track, and that might be nearby. So it could be 100 meters away from your known fixed location. But the deviation that they are both experiencing from atmospheric conditions is going to be almost the same. So by calculating the correction factor at the fixed location, you can then transmit that correction factor to the mobile device, which then applies that correction to itself, and it says, I've calculated my position as this, but that reference point over there tells me that right at this moment the atmospheric conditions are deviating the signal in this way, so I'll apply the correction and I'll report my location as this. So it then reports the corrected location. And what that allows you to do is have GPS that instead of being 10 meter accuracy, it might be a couple of centimeters accuracy. So that's the sort of thing that I've been wanting to experiment with as well. Now, in terms of working within a building, that's no good because you get, in my particular case, we've got a metal roof and insulation and all sorts of other things that interfere with the signal. But it's still a very interesting thing. And what I was wanting to do, my general plan for this is I'm going to put a GPS receiver on the Husqvarna auto mower and probably mount a camera, maybe even on a pole. I put it up on the roof of the house on a pole looking down because I want to get an aerial view and record the position of the mower on video, and also have the position reported back by GPS, and then show how much it deviates from the actual position. So as the mower moves around, the GPS position should follow it accurately, but it won't, it'll wander. And by overlaying the reported GPS position with the video feed of where the mower actually is, we can see that variation. And I want to set up a fixed reference point on my roof and check it out. Okay, so maybe moving on from that. Yes, so James said, are your PowerPoints connected to your home automation system? And the other James said, metal roofs and GPS do not work well together. Exactly, that's spot on. So in terms of PowerPoints, right now, no. At the time that we did this, and I think possibly even now, it's not so easy. You can get light switch replacements, and there are things like the son-off for loads. But certainly a few years ago when we did the wiring here, there was not a smart PowerPoint drop-in replacement. And another friend of mine, Luke Weston, worked a few years ago on a project called Home Run. And I'm not sure if it was ever actually made available, but he certainly made some prototypes of it. And that is a smart PowerPoint with built-in power monitoring. And the idea is that you could, it was basically like, imagine that IT brought out a son-off PowerPoint. That's essentially what it is. And so what you could do is control it via I can't remember what Luke was using, what communications method. It might have been Zigbee. I can't remember. It was a few years ago. So the idea is that you control your power points from your home automation system. You could also just press a button or flick a switch on the power point itself to turn it on and off manually, because you don't want to have to pull your phone out of your pocket just to turn something on or off. And it would also monitor the power consumption. So he was using, in fact, I think he was using pretty much the same technology as this. And in fact, I think it was Luke who designed the PCB for this power monitoring system. It would have been around the same time that he was working on the home run system. So this power monitoring for smart energy groups was designed by Luke Weston. And so the technology that was used in that was also built into his little home run smart power points. So I would very much like to be able to control the power points in the house. It would be really nice if there was a device that was a retrofit. So basically you take off your old power point and you screw a new one in its place, or an electrician does it if you're in a country like Australia that requires this work to be done by an electrician, and put it back in place. You still have the normal power point, but you can also control it from your home automation system. I would like to do that. Okay. Would Sonoff Basic relay switch work without the neutral running through it? Was a question from Chris. So you need the neutral to run to it in order to power the device itself. The exception is in the case of the Sonoff SV, which is the safe voltage version. Now the way a Sonoff works is that you have the input side that comes in, which is the mains, and you have the neutral and active, and then on the output you have neutral and active as well. The neutral is a direct pass through and the active is switched. So when the relay fires, it turns on the active on the output. Now the reason that you need to run the neutral to it, even though it's just a pass through, is that the Sonoff itself needs to get its power from somewhere, and it has a little built-in power supply so that it basically takes power off the active and neutral that you're connecting to it in order to run itself. So if you have a situation, one of the really common problems, and I've heard from many people about this, is if you want to use a Sonoff to replace a light switch, and you have a typical wiring system, which is you have active and neutral running through the ceiling, and then the electrician will typically run a loop. So the active will come down to the switch and then go back up again, but the neutral won't come down. It'll only be the active wire that loops down. One of the common questions I get is, how do I take the light switch off and put the Sonoff in its place, like mount it inside the wall so that it can control the light? And the problem, oh yeah, active is live in UK, so yeah, different terminology. So the problem is that you don't have the neutral at that location in order to power the Sonoff itself. So there are a couple of solutions to that, and I do want to do a specific episode about this. Now the thing is that in my own house, I actually don't have this situation at all, because the entire house has been wired from scratch for home automation. So what I need to do is go to someone else's house and demonstrate how to overcome these sorts of problems. So what I might do is see if my mum, who has an older house without any home automation at all, is interested in me putting some of this stuff in. So there are 3 solutions. Well, 4. I won't get into this in a whole lot of detail now, because I want to actually do this in a proper episode and not give you like a half thought through answer. One is using a Sonoff SV. So the SV is what they call a safe voltage version. It has a switched output, but it doesn't take its power off the load. it requires some local power supply, and I think it might be 5 volts, I can't remember. But basically, if you can run some kind of a low voltage power supply to the SON-OFF, then you can have a just switch and active, and you don't need the neutral in the location. But the problem, of course, then is you've still got to get power to the SON-OFF. How do you do that? That could be a real problem. So another solution is that you can relocate the SON-OFF up into the ceiling space. So at the point where the active line comes down to the switch and then back up again, where it comes down from, neutral will be there as well, because basically the active and neutral will run around. Typically what will happen is that the active and neutral will run to the, say, the back of the light fitting, and the active, instead of just terminating at the fitting, will then loop down to the switch and then go back again. Or there'll be some arrangement like that, some variation on that. So by putting the SON-OFF in the ceiling space, you can then basically put it directly in line with the power that goes to the load, and you avoid the whole problem. But that's often not convenient as well. Sometimes it can be really hard. Oh, SON-OFF SV is 5 to 24 volt supply. Thanks, Ray. It's good for clarifying that. So sometimes you can have a lot of trouble, particularly with retrofits. It can be difficult to get into a ceiling space, or it can be difficult to get into that area where you want to install a SON-OFF. And in some situations like this is where I would probably go for something like a smart light globe, and once again avoid the problem entirely. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about making sure you use the appropriate solution to the problem. Now, SON-OFFs are fantastic in certain situations, but they don't solve every single problem. There are some times where you have to take some other steps, such as putting in LifeX globes and using Wi-Fi. So you then have the limitations of relying on Wi-Fi for your home automation system to work, but that may be a trade-off that you just have to make if you can't physically get the cables through to where you want to go. So one of the other things you can do is, one of the questions I've had a few times, particularly after my 6 SON-OFF secrets video, was about using an external switch or a button to control the SON-OFF. And how do you do that with the SON-OFF when you only have the active coming down in the loop? So you've got the dual problem that you've only got the active coming down, and you also want to have a switch to control the SON-OFF externally. So one way to do that is to mount the SON-OFF up inside the ceiling space. And something that I don't recommend doing, but it can be done, is to use the 2 actives that normally loop down through the switch as, and you can actually just leave the switch in place. So the switch itself doesn't need to be changed. You don't even need to pull it off the wall. The 2 actives, so the one that comes down and the return that goes back up to it, if you cut those at the top, and then you can use those as the switch input to the SON-OFF. The reason I really don't like doing that is that it can be deceptive. If you use, if you have an electrician come along a little bit later and they don't know what's up inside the ceiling. So you've got your SON-OFF mounted up there, and you've used the 2 actives with the switch on the end of it to control the SON-OFF. So you've got them connected to a logic input on the SON-OFF itself. They don't know any of that. So you really have to think about, someone's going to come along and something goes wrong that might be a subsequent owner of the house, and they call an electrician and say, my lights aren't working, what's going on? They'll walk up to the wall, take the light switch off, and they'll see the active coming down and looping back up. They've got no idea that that's a logic level control that's running your SON-OFF. They don't even know the SON-OFF exists. So their immediate thought is going to be, I don't have mains voltage on this active, so this circuit is broken. And who knows what's going to happen after that. Could be all sorts of bad things. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here. What I want to do is a video specifically about how to wire up SON-offs in less than ideal situations. Places like you only have the active loop down to the switch, and or other problems. So I do want to do a video about that and draw diagrams, and I'll do that later. It really needs a whole episode, not just an off the top of my head answer here. Okay, so what have we got? More comments about, oh yeah, a really neat way of solving the retrofit switching challenge is to use a kinetic wireless switching controller, no wires and no safety issues. Comment by James. Yes, so that is really interesting technology as well. For those of you that haven't seen this, it's basically an energy harvesting system. So with a normal light switch, obviously, any kind of active switch, you need power to it. The problem is, how do you get power to a light switch? And you either have a cable that goes in behind it, or a battery. And one of the fairly common approaches to the RF-based home automation systems is you get light switches, which basically you just double-sided tape them onto the wall, and they have a battery in them like a coin cell, and you have to replace it from time to time. So when you press the button, it's like sending a signal for an RF remote control for your garage door or something. Same sort of technology. In fact, it's very similar to a video I did about the, what was it called? The $6 universal home automation button or something. And so you've got to either run power to it by cables or have a battery. Now, with the kinetic systems that I think it was James was mentioning, what they do is energy harvesting. So the physical action of pressing the switch causes movement, and I think typically they use like a piezoelectric effect. I'm not that familiar with how they work in terms of their internals, but it transmits a signal, and which can be picked up by some other device which is wired into the rest of your system and then can send that signal on. So what you can do is have a light switch at the wall that when you press it, it will send an RF signal, but there are no batteries involved. It just harvests the energy from the physical, like the kinetic motion of pressing the button to generate the power to send the signal. So you never need to change the batteries. Now there was a comment there, Bruce Cushman just said, new international code requires power at all switches. That is interesting. I hadn't heard of that before. So by that, maybe Bruce can clarify. Does that mean that you are required to have both active and neutral at all switches? Or does it mean that you need to have some kind of power? Does it mean that battery-powered switches aren't legal? I don't know what that really means. So I think that might need a little bit of research to figure out what's going on there. Okay. Well, thanks, Bruce. I wasn't aware of that, so I will look into that and see what I can figure out. Okay. Okay, Michael said, does any device exist that could use an induction loop that charges a local battery when the light is active? Kind of a mixture of both solutions. I don't know. I've certainly seen some fun induction loop systems, and low voltage lighting. Okay, I'll get back to that because that's kind of an important point as well. So induction loop, I saw some fun tricks done with that at Maker Faire in Shenzhen in China when I was there just recently, and I did a video about the Maker Faire. I think it was just like a vlog. It wasn't a proper Superhouse episode. And somewhere through this video there was a here it is. I will paste this link in. Partway through this video you will see some little magic lights that that float. So what they were doing was using magnetic levitation and induction to pass power through. So the lights themselves would be on their little fancy base, and they would sit floating in the air with nothing underneath them, and the light would be illuminated. And they were receiving their power through an induction coil that was mounted underneath. And yeah, they're kind of cool. So I'm not quite sure how practical that is. People have been trying to talk about power transmission and induction ever since Tesla all those years ago. And I've used inductive chargers for mobile phones and they work, but it's just one of those things where the efficiencies seem to be the lack of efficiency is too difficult to overcome. YouTube redirected added something to the URL again. Okay. It's invisible though. That's interesting. I think it's probably just tracking. As long as the URL itself works when you click on it, I think it should be fine. But what YouTube is probably doing is just checking how many people click on that link. So, hey, they know. Oh, that link was broken. Okay. If you, it looks like the links I'm posting aren't working very well. So the way to find it is go to SuperHouse.tv and click on the vlog link at the top. And I think it was the second most recent episode. Let's see. Yes, it is. SuperHouse vlog number 60, Maker Faire Shenzhen, China. So if you click on the vlog link at the top, it's the second last entry, and that video has some footage of some little induction things in it that some people were playing with. What's the trailing backslash? Okay. Yeah, that was fun, but I don't know that it would be all that practical. You could possibly do something using the Qi wireless standard, the wireless charging standard that's used on mobile phones. You can get little Qi induction coils very easily and cheaply, and you can power whatever you like with them. So the friend of mine from Melbourne Hackerspace, John Spencer, recently made up a little device where he had a plastic container. So it was a Tupperware container with an Arduino-based device in it. It had, I think it was a Lowland 32 Lite, which is ESP32 based, and he got a mobile phone induction coil and mounted it in the base, and it's got a battery in it. So basically he's got himself a little Arduino-based data logging device that he can charge just by sitting it down on a mobile phone charging pad. So you can build those sorts of things. Maybe that's an idea for a future project. Okay, so there was a question of magic mirror. Yes, I've got all the parts for that right here. That is really high on my list. So getting back to the mains voltage versus low voltage for lighting. Okay, many years ago, I thought that what we would have is, by now we would probably have 12 volts or something similar wired around our houses, and mains would only be used for things like washing machines and very high powered devices. And the reason for that I thought that would be popular, a couple of reasons. But one was it sounds on the face of it that it would simplify things, because you don't have to, because most devices in our house run from 5 volts or 12 volts, or internally many of them run even lower. They might run on 3.3 volt processors. And so a lot of the devices you have around your house really only need 5 volts. And stepping down mains voltage, which 240 volts or 110 or whatever it is, to 5 volts DC can be problematic. It means that you are stepping down from that high voltage at all of the endpoints instead of doing it once and then distributing the lower voltage. But there are drawbacks. So when I was thinking about this many years ago, I thought, oh yeah, it makes total sense, because what you can do is have, say, a 12 volt power supply, which is very efficient in one location, say even in your switchboard, and then have 12 volt wiring all around the house so that you can plug things in. And it means you can do things like run linear regulators or other cheap and simple regulators at different locations. There are a couple of reasons I think that it hasn't come about. One is, yep, Nick Cooper just said thicker cables, voltage drop, etc. Yes, and Chris said can't push 12 volts over long distance. Yes, once again, you need the thicker cables to overcome that. And so the cabling is a problem. So I think there are, off the top of my head, there are probably 3 reasons why that sort of thing hasn't come about and why more people don't do it. One is that you do need thick cables, because for the same amount of power you need higher current at that voltage in order to get at the lower voltage to get the amount of power through. So you get more voltage drop problems, because voltage drop is proportional to the square of the current, I think, if I remember correctly. So you get less loss if you're running high voltage low current than if you're running low voltage high current, all other things being equal. So that's one. 2 is it means you end up with 2 different wiring systems. So you still need the mains level wiring for most things. You have this inertia problem where most devices expect to be plugged into 240 volts or 110 volts. So they're built for it. So there's this changeover period, and once you have an installed base that expects a certain standard, changing to another standard is very, very difficult. And the third reason that I think it hasn't caught on is that it's actually now much easier, safer and cheaper to convert from mains voltage down to a safe operational voltage than it used to be. So back when I was thinking about this was like 25 years ago, the standard thing was you would have a linear transformer in, where is one? I probably even have trouble finding one these days. But basically you would buy a device and it would come with this big transformer that you would plug into the wall, and it would run hot. And so it was converting the, like in my case, the 240 volt AC mains down to say 12 volts, and yeah, big heavy transformer, exactly. And it would emit a fair bit of heat. They'd be physically bulky, and because they got so much metal in them, they cost a bit to manufacture. And yes, hail the SMPS, exactly. And so it's now possible to get switch mode power supplies that are very efficient, and they're quite small, and the price on them has come down. And also, because the operating frequency on them has increased over time, the early switch mode power supplies had they would run a fairly low frequency, and what that meant is that the inductors were physically large, and sometimes you would get a whistle from them, and there were various issues like that. And what's happened over time as switch mode power supply technology has been refined is that they have started to run at higher and higher frequencies, and that has the effect that the inductors have got much smaller, and so it's pretty normal now for switch mode power supplies to run in the megahertz region. They used to be like in the kilohertz region. So they are now very small, very cheap, and in fact I wonder if I've got one here. There's a project I'm working on. I'll probably drop out of camera for a minute. There's a project I'm working on for a video that I'm going to be doing really soon about environmental monitoring, and I'm working on making some tiny little environmental monitoring devices. And this is a switch mode power supply. Oh, where's the camera? Got to get it up to it. This is a Monsun switch mode power supply, which will convert. This one doesn't switch from mains. It's only like up to 28 volts input, but still, it's just an example of what I'm talking about. This particular one gives 5 volts output. I've also got some 3.3 volt versions on order, but it's a direct drop-in replacement for an old style linear regulator, and it's not really all that much bigger. It's a tiny little device, and it allows you to very efficiently convert from up to a 28 volt input in that case, down to 5 volts with very little heat given off. So they're equivalent modules. I've used some in some projects, like in my blind controllers. Just thinking about where they would be right now. Not sure. So you can get little modules that you feed 240 volts into it and you get 5 volts out at very high efficiency, and they don't cost very much. And the thing is that is so easy now that it's not a real problem to build a device that you plug into mains voltage. So, yep. Oh yeah, I should try to explain acronyms whenever. Oh, and James said, yeah, megahertz frequency switch mode PSUs, unless you're a radio amateur who uses HF radio. Yes, so that is quite an issue as well. So as all sorts of devices now are running at higher and higher frequencies, interference is more of an issue now, I think, than it used to be. So a few years ago, I got my amateur radio license. In fact, you can just see on camera, there's a, it's just in the field of view there, there's a transceiver. Because I wanted to be able to receive data from ArduSat, and I set up my own little monitoring station here so that I could receive the data packets that ArduSat was transmitting as it passed overhead. And yeah, interference is not good. So use of the spectrum is a bit of an issue, which is why things like compliance is important, and making sure that things are made to work to the standards. SMPS frequency is standardized. Is it? Okay. I've seen many different frequencies of switch mode power supplies. Yeah, okay. So, this is an ICOM, what model? Can't even remember what model it is. It's an ICOM IC7000. That one doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my friend Julian Goodwin up in Sydney, and he moved into an apartment up there, didn't have any way to use it, and I was getting into amateur radio at the time, so he lent it to me. So I'm making use of it while he can't. So Julian, if you want your radio back, it's still here. So, okay. All right. So I'm kind of running out of energy here now. When I started this, my general concept was, oh yeah, maybe I'll talk for an hour, and now it's coming up, heading towards 2 hours. So I'll just maybe cover one or two more things, and then I'll wrap it up. And maybe we can do it again another time. So, oh yeah, what's my amateur call? VK3FADO. Although I think my my membership has expired, so anyway, I need to get back on and renew my license. So just a couple of random things to wrap it up. What are your thoughts on Home Assistant, and what about the IKEA smart lights? I'm right at the start of this this live stream. I mentioned that I don't really know much about Home Assistant, and I wish I knew more. So one of the things that I would like to do, if I had the time to do it, would be to sit down with a range of different home automation systems and run them all in parallel. Well, not necessarily live running my house, but at least install them and try configuring some devices on them so that I have some understanding of how they work. At the moment, my knowledge is really limited to the things I've played with because they happen to be whatever was in front of me at the time. So Home Assistant, from what I've just seen about it online, it seems to have come a long way. It looks like a very well polished system now. So I'd like to give that a try. Okay, so how do you... okay. I think this... I just touch on this and then wrap it up. So Minecraft Man said, how do you handle home automation controller redundancy? And okay, so right now I have one active controller. So I have two of those little brain boxes that you might have seen in a previous video. The brain itself essentially contains a Raspberry Pi and a custom circuit board that I designed, which provides a power supply and a 433 megahertz transmitter and receiver, and a couple of other things. So it's all a little self-contained unit. And so I have one active, which is currently running OpenHAB 1.8.3, I think, and another one right beside it, which is physically identical, but it's running OpenHAB 2. So so if my primary controller totally died, like right now in the middle of this event, what I would do is pull the SD card out of the live one and put it into the other one and start it up again. And hopefully I would be back up and running. But what I don't have is automatic failover, and I don't have any kind of replication. This is a topic that I really want to cover in the future as well. I want to do at least one video about this. So way back in the distant past, through my former software company, I did a bit of work with redundant web servers. So I did work with things like clustered servers with failover, and with things like a stonith system, which is STONITH, which stands for shoot the other node in the head. And that's where you have, say, a pair of web servers, and each one of them has physical control over the power supply of the other web server. So yeah, it's not a disaster recovery plan until it has been tested many times. Exactly. And do I keep a backup SD card? Yes, and the configuration is all in Git. So I've got multiple levels of paranoia here, but what I don't have is that automatic failover. I'm pretty sure I could recover very quickly if I had to, but it would be a manual process. So I'm losing track of it again. Oh, and James said, will you post this so I can watch what I missed? Yes, this will be up as a recording on the Superhouse channel. So in terms of what I've done with stonith systems in the past, the way they work is that you have, say, two web servers. They might both be, or this works with routers and things as well. And I'm going to also cover that because I'm going to do an episode about building the ultimate home router with proper full hardware redundancy and failover and that sort of thing. And I've got all the equipment here for that as well, so I'm going to show you how that works. And the way they work is that the two servers have a heartbeat system, so they are both checking whether the other one is still okay and responding properly. And if either of them stops working, you need to make absolutely sure that it's taken out of the system so that you don't have a situation where you've got two controllers that are both trying to send signals at the same time, and they're both internally maintaining their own concept of state. So they both think, oh yeah, that light is turned on and that one is turned off. But then if their state gets out of sync for any reason, you can end up with a really big problem. Your logic can get totally screwed up, your UI isn't going to work properly, etc. So what happens is that those two systems check each other, and if they detect that the other one is not responding properly for any reason, it turns off its power supply. So that's where the shoot the other node in the head term comes from. It's basically like two servers with a gun pointed at each other, and if either of them blinks, the other one shoots it. So that way you know that if either of them fails for some reason, it gets taken totally out of the system and it can't then screw things up. So I've done work with that sort of thing with web servers in the past, and I want to try applying some of that to home automation controllers. Now, there is some incredibly interesting work that was done by my friend Andy Jolmy a few years ago, which was done commercially and under an NDA, and he's shown me some of how it works. He's given me a bit of a demo, and what he's working on doing at the moment is getting it all released as open source, so that then we can talk about it. But the very short summary of it is that it was a system that allows complete decentralization of the logic of a home automation system. And it was a level of abstraction that allowed services to float between different pieces of hardware depending on hardware availability to make a really resilient and redundant system with no one central place that can die and take down the system. And how they achieve that is quite interesting. So hopefully sometime in the future he's going to get permission to release that as open source, because the project it was working on never ended up being commercialized. They had a whole lot of engineers working for a number of years building this system, and then because of various business reasons it just never went to market, and all of this amazing code is sitting there locked up under NDA and no one can use it. So that hopefully we'll be able to talk about that soon. But if we can talk about that, it will mean that there will be the possibility of having automated service discovery and different other benefits as well. So yeah, okay. So someone talked about. Someone just asked earlier. I'm going to have to wrap this up. Someone talked about, is this video going to be available for access later? And the answer is yes. So the way this live stream has worked, it's being recorded at YouTube, and once I finish this, it should publish it. The live chat will stop, I think, when that happens, but you'll still be able to post comments afterwards. So one of the things I've been trying to figure out is how to do this sort of thing more regularly, and how to make this sustainable as well, because part of the issue is that I would love to be spending all my time working on this. And one of the reason that Superhouse videos come out so infrequently is that I can't put my time into this, because there's a whole lot of extra stuff on happening in the background that I can't really talk about, or don't want to talk about from a business point of view, that's put me in a very bad financial position. And what it means is that I don't have the opportunity or the leisure to be able to spend my time working on this and putting up videos. I need to be figuring out ways to make money so that I can keep the lights on and eat. So what I need to do is figure out some kind of a balance, some way that I can put time into doing all of this sort of thing and not go broke. So there are a few things that I've with a live chat we save with the video. I think so. This is the first time I've done this, so we'll find out what happens. I think the live chat ends up being archived with it or something, so that it's still visible, but you can't add to it. So what I've been thinking about doing, and I'd really appreciate feedback from people about this, whether they'd be upset about it or not, is doing something like having live streams that are only accessible to Patreon supporters. Maybe do something like, I don't think live chat exists. Okay, so what I could do is maybe for the Patreon supporters have a live chat that they can access, and either just keep it private forever, or have it so that Patreon supporters can be live here and chat to me, and then the video gets archived and made accessible to everybody else. But in order to participate in the chat, you need to be a Patreon supporter, or something like that. I don't know quite yet, and I would like to find ways to make this more sustainable. Part of that, and that's also partly why I've started putting products up on the Superhouse site. So if I can make kits and things or products available that are related to the projects, then that makes it all more worthwhile as well. So if I can sell products that go along with the projects that I show, and I want to, it's a difficult line to balance, because I don't want this just to be me being totally commercial. I really want to be able to show as much as possible about how things work, and be as open about it as possible, and also show the process, because I think that's really valuable. I don't want to just go away and spend a whole lot of time working on something and then say, here's the finished polished product and you can buy it, because that doesn't really have so much value. What I think is really valuable is showing how I make things, and then if I sell things on the Superhouse site, that's more a way of helping other people to build that same project. It's not a case of, oh, here's this product and I'm going to get rich out of selling 1 million of them. It's more, this is a product, or this is a project that I've worked on, and I've explained the thought process and how I came about designing it this way. And here are some things that you can buy that will help you do the same thing. So that's the way I'm approaching it. And another idea I had for live streams in the future is live design, and I've got an idea for a project. That little voltage regulator I showed you a moment ago is for a video I'm working on, which I want to do in 2 stages. One is showing how to do it just using regular off-the-shelf parts, and then the second video will be taking that design or that prototype and making a custom PCB that is optimized just for that particular project. And I think that would be really useful, because it helps explain the sequence of events when you go from the idea of a device and you prototype it, maybe using like an Arduino or whatever easily available off-the-shelf parts there are. And then if you want to make that into an actual reproducible device, like a product that you can make in quantity, you then need to take that design, convert it into a circuit board, and have the circuit board manufactured, and then you've got to fit it into the case and firmware and all of those things. So what I want to do is record a video that shows that entire process, starting with Eagle and how I lay out the board, like do the schematic, lay out the board, send it off for production and everything. So you get to see the whole process that I go through for that. So also taxation is theft. Okay, random. Okay, so I think I'm gonna have to wrap it up there, but thank you very much. When I set this up, I thought I might get 5 or 10 people coming along, and that'll be cool. We can have a little chat about a few things. So the fact that I had over 200 people at one point on this stream is amazing. So, so thank you very much for being along in the chat, and I'm going to get on with some other things today and work on some more videos. So if I'm going to do another live stream, I will definitely let you know. Thanks. See ya.